The IS-2 tank was one of the most powerful heavy tanks produced by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and it left a lasting impression on both the battlefield and military history. This tank, whose full name was IS-2, was designed as a direct answer to the German heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther that had shown dominance in combat. The Soviet Union needed a vehicle that could provide both strong offensive firepower and heavy protection to push through enemy lines, and the IS-2 was developed to meet that role. Introduced in 1944, it quickly became one of the key weapons of the Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe and eventually into Berlin itself. The IS-2 was a development of the earlier KV series of heavy tanks, but while the KV tanks had been impressive in armor, they were often criticized for being underarmed against the newer German tanks. Engineers learned from these shortcomings and designed the IS series to mount a much larger gun. The IS-2 was armed with a massive 122mm D-25T gun, which gave it the ability to destroy German tanks at long range and also fire powerful high-explosive shells that could demolish bunkers, buildings, and fortifications. The firepower of the IS-2 was one of its most feared qualities. German tank crews quickly realized that even their strongest vehicles were vulnerable to the IS-2's gun, which could penetrate thick armor and disable tanks like the Tiger I in just a few shots. Armor protection was another critical aspect of the IS-2's design. The front armor was sloped and up to 120mm thick, making it difficult for German anti-tank weapons to penetrate. The sloped armor not only increased the effective thickness but also improved the chances of deflecting incoming shells. Compared to earlier Soviet tanks like the T-34, the IS-2 was significantly heavier, with a weight of around 46 tons, but it was still considered more mobile than the German Tiger II, which was heavier and slower. This balance of firepower, protection, and mobility gave the IS-2 a strong advantage in many battlefield situations. The crew of the IS-2 consisted of 4 men, a commander, a driver, a loader, and a gunner. The large 122mm gun required a 2-part shell, with the projectile and the propellant loaded separately, which made the rate of fire slower compared to tanks with smaller guns. On average, the IS-2 could fire about 2 to 3 rounds per minute, which was lower than some German tanks. However, the destructive power of each shot meant that the IS-2 did not need to fire as often to achieve devastating results. One hit was often enough to destroy or cripple an enemy tank or position. Production of the IS-2 was prioritized because of the urgent need to counter German heavy armor. Factories in the Soviet Union began producing the tank in significant numbers, and by 1944 it was deployed to frontline units. It first saw major combat during the Soviet offensives to liberate Ukraine and Poland, where it proved itself as a formidable machine against entrenched German positions. In battles such as those around Lvov and later during the Vistula-Oder operation, IS-2 tanks spearheaded Soviet advances, smashing through defenses that lighter tanks would have struggled to overcome. One of the most famous roles of the IS-2 was during the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Soviet forces used these tanks in urban combat, where their high-explosive shells were particularly effective at destroying German defenses in buildings and fortified structures. The large gun could blast open walls and clear obstacles, allowing infantry to advance behind them. While the streets of Berlin were filled with Panzerfaust-armed German soldiers who posed a constant threat, the heavy armor of the IS-2 gave it a better chance of surviving close-range attacks. In the final days of the war, the sight of IS-2 tanks rumbling through the ruined streets of Berlin became a symbol of Soviet victory. Despite its strengths, the IS-2 was not without flaws. The slow reload speed of